The magic of Doctor Who is nothing is what it appears to be. The police box is not a police box. The Doctor is not an old human being. Susan is not a school child. Running through Doctor Who is the thing is, look at life. There's more to life than you think. Life is not straightforward. To get the most out of life, you need to dig a bit deeper. So I think that's part of the magic of it.
Time for Type 40, your Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network, with me, Dan Hadley, Birmingham's king of the geeks, materialising here with more top draw Doctor Who conversation on our free-speaking, big-thinking show for everyone. The ongoing adventures of our hero, Doctor Who. We talk about it all on this show. And who knows, there could be a few laughs along the way too. So it's Doctor Who Podcast Day 2024. Time to get creative. Time to get historical here on Type 40. Hello, yes, and welcome back to the next new era of Type 40, beginning here on Doctor Who Podcast Day 2024. And of course, it's not just me you're going to be listening to rattling on and on about all of time and space and time. I've got them too to fill up our virtual console room here. We're going to lock the door so they can't get out when I bring back some of the regulars. Okay, so who's with me this time? I am happy to say, back on the deck, fall in, Mr. Simon Horton.
Ah, hello. How lovely to be here again. And it's summertime, and it is like summer, finally.
At last, yeah, in fits and starts. But at least, the series, the all-new series, that's in the rearview mirror now, so we've got time to take stock a little bit and to get historical and to celebrate the length and the breadth and the width of Doctor Who here for Doctor Who Podcast Day again.
It's funny, isn't it? It doesn't matter however much Doctor Who keeps going, he keeps on putting out new material. We never get bored of the old stuff as well. It never feels like replacing the old stuff with the new, and so you're no longer interested in the old. Somehow it seems to work the opposite. The more you see of Doctor Who, the more you want to keep seeing a Doctor Who and delving into the past. It's always good to delve into the past. I'm very much a nostalgist. I live in the past in many ways.
It amazes me year on year, Simon, how much we can excavate from the history of Doctor Who, particularly from the classic show. You would think it would all be dried up now, but it absolutely isn't. There's still fresh antiquities.
Yeah, treasures, fresh treasures. There is always little bits to find. And we've said before now, will we ever get bored of talking about Doctor Who? Nah, don't think so.
And talking about little treasures, I'm happy to say we're joined by two more back on the show. Rounding out the team, we've got Charlotte Shields and Sarah
everybody.
Graham back. Hello, both.
Hello, gang.
Sarah, you and I are very floral today, aren't we?
We are very
We're both
floral.
very
It's
floral.
a summer wardrobe.
It is.
You can finally get your nice clothes out.
It is
And the
fun.
legs. It's nice to get the legs out.
So yes, here we are back in the Type 40, back in the time and space capsule for Doctor Who Podcast Day. Yes, there's a day for that now as well. It's simply a one-day event to celebrate the community and the creativity of Doctor Who podcasting for both the listeners and the content creators. On the 9th of August each year, it's a nod to the legacy of Doctor Who podcasting, which began when Doctor Who Podshock published its first episode on that date, all the way back in 2005. And as well as all that looking backwards, there's pointing the way to the future too, as befits Doctor Who fandom. So all of us who gather together and talk about the world's greatest TV show never need a great deal of encouragement. It has to be said, but a whole day dedicated to celebrating and extending the family of Doctor Who podcasters. Well, that's got to be a good thing, isn't it? And everybody who's involved has been using these hashtags, hashtag DWPD and hashtag Doctor Who Podcast Day. This time we've set ourselves a very particular task here at Type 40 for Doctor Who Podcast Day. What on earth am I talking about? This wasn't necessarily my idea. I'll admit that now. I first heard about this over on X. So it started out as a kind of viral meme, really. But I think it works better. I think it works better as a conversation. We're all used to seeing pictures of America's shrine to democracy, Mount Rushmore National Memorial, in history books and magazines and on television throughout the decades. Mount Rushmore features the faces of 4 iconic American presidents. And for this show, we're going to rank the 4 most iconic personalities of Doctor Who. And this isn't just about who's popular either. It's to venerate those who've truly defined the series over the decades. So the question is, who are we to come up with 4 out of all of the dozens, maybe hundreds of people who are involved in bringing Doctor Who to screen in the first place?
Do you know what I noticed when I look at that Mount Rushmore? On the left, I can already see William Hartnell. Second one, I can see Paul McGann. The last one looks very much like Patrick Troughton. I think we're kind of there, aren't we?
Oh, and the third one with that tash is the brig.
Yes.
Oh, you're right.
That's it. That's the shortest podcast ever.
That's it. Well done, everybody. Good show.
It's predestined. I remember seeing pictures of Mount Rushmore in various textbooks and things from when I was at school. I was never really sure what it was. And it's the kind of thing that would pop up in reference in things like Looney Tunes cartoons. Bugs Bunny would chip away at it so it would resemble him rather than one of the presidents. It was that kind of thing. But I was never really sure where it was, who these people were, and what any of it was about. But I've got 5 fabulous facts here about Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is located in the Black Hills of Keystone, South Dakota, and around 3 million people each year visit the location. The sculpture features the 60-foot faces of 4 US presidents. That's George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. It's not Paul McGann. And the sculptor, who was Gutzon Borglum, chose those presidents because he believed they represented the most important events in American history. And the memorial took 14 years to complete, cost a fortune. Nearly 400 workers were involved in the project, which used dynamite for 90% of the carving, which looks so intricate in the pictures. You do wonder how they would do that. Mount Rushmore remains unfinished because Borglum died before the project could be completed, and funding completely ran out. But only the presidents' heads were carved. The mountain was named after New York attorney Charles E. Rushmore. I've no idea why him in particular, but it was obviously it was Borglum's choice. So yeah, an incredible feat of, we would call it creativity, engineering, and sheer stupidity. The guys, 400 people who were quite happy to do this with dynamite.
You do think nowadays you wouldn't get that through any planning whatsoever, would you?
Not at all.
You would just be like, no, too many deaths. You're not even trying that.
No hard hats, Charlotte. Just cloth caps.
Just a bit of rope, yeah. That's all you need.
It seems
can you
good,
imagine?
In Doctor Who history, he's been immortalised and carved into stone. I'm thinking particularly about in the face of evil, Simon, all the way back in 1977. Now, I hazard a guess that no dynamite was used in the making of this iconic scene from that 4-part story all the way back then. But it has to be sort of partly inspired, I think, by Mount Rushmore. What do you think?
I think they probably used cornflake packets and some sticky back plastic to make that, truth be told. But yeah, I mean, I've always assumed that this was kind of inspired rather by Mount Rushmore. It is very much the Mount Rushmore of Doctor Who, isn't it? I can still remember, when I first watched The Face of Evil, and there's the big reveal at the end of episode 1, and I couldn't work out that was actually supposed to be Tom Baker. So it was completely lost on me as how old was I? I was about 9 at the time, 8 or 9 at the time, and I just didn't get that was supposed to be, because it's not the greatest likeness, if we're brutally honest.
It's mainly the hair that sort of gives you the clue that's
yes.
Tom. It's yeah.
Oh, yes. So we're talking about this huge historic national monument that so many of us recognise. But who could possibly be fit to be chipped into the Mount Rushmore of Doctor Who? We'll all be revealing our candidates right after I remind you, if you want to do some real-time travelling of your own, each and every edition of this show, past, present and future, is only a tap or two away on the device of your choice. If you know where to look, there's over 150 podcasts, a timeless mix of reviews, previews, interviews, geek outs and deep dives with all our regular panellists and lots of awesome guests. There's something for every fan over at type40.podbean.com. We'll remind you about that again later, and we'll be making a trip sideways in time to plug our sister, brother, cousins and others podcasts across the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network too. Okay, so let's get on with something truly monumental in podcasting anyway. Doctor Who may not be quite as old as Mount Rushmore is, but the tendency to make these lists and have these geeky conversations, that is as old as the hills. Hold on tight, grab your sonic screwdriver, and let's find out who's made the cut. The world's longest running best loved sci-fi and fantasy TV series now approaching a 61st birthday, well, there's generations of TV creatives and on-screen talent that have been responsible for many of its sort of reinventions over the decades, haven't there? And some have been more successful than others. Some are more fondly recalled than others. And hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. It's always 2020. We are, of course, blessed with the hindsight of 4 people here making up the panel. So surely between us, with however many decades of fandom and of clocked viewing time that we've got behind us, we can come up with a virtual monument that's representative of the true Mount Rushmore, can't we? And explain how the various people that we commit to the granite may represent the birth, the growth, the development, and the preservation of Doctor Who. It may be a daunting task to narrow down that list of people, but we're going to do our level best and explain how we come to our selections before embedding the final 4 in their places on Type 40's very own Mount Who. I felt surprisingly cocky about this idea, about this concept when I first came up with it. I don't mind telling you, everybody, but when it sank in, what I was attempting to do, that's when I started to get a little bit antsy about it, because our views about Doctor Who, about individual stories and performances and things like that can often be really, really subjective, because the bond that we form with it is all quite subjective. And that's the joy in listing anything, usually, and comparing and contrasting. But I think this is slightly different. As I put together a little list, because we kept to just sort of 4 principal names each, didn't we? But as I came to that little list, I found myself saying, oh, and this person, oh, and that person, oh, and them, and them, and them. Oh, I can't possibly not include them. And before I knew it, I got 20 names. It was ridiculous, Charlotte.
Well, my first 3, I sort of, not easily, but I felt like they were easier to come across. And then my 4th slot, which I sort of had a category I was picking from, but it was who was going to be that, like the representation for that category, that kept changing. And that was one that I kept going back and forward about. Was my first 3, I was pretty solid. But yeah, it's one of those things that you think you know, don't you? And then you go, oh, but this thing or this story or this event, you go, oh no, I need to, and you go, no, you have to just be a bit sort of harsh.
Brutal. And the remit was, Sarah, this has got to be fun. Don't take it too seriously. But I did. You can't help. So I've got my list. It's just like you were saying, Dan. I was like, yeah, but what about this and that and that? No, yeah. And I can't forget about this, and this is really important. Yeah, and then you just have to say, well, what do you feel is important to you? Because at the end of the day, it is subjective. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see.
I must be honest. When I got the email from you, Dan, to say what we were doing, I was like, "What? We're doing what? Such a big ask. How do you even begin? It was a really difficult call. On the one hand, I came up with my names actually very quickly.
Very quickly indeed.
I did, didn't I? Because it seemed so obvious, but there's only afterwards. I was thinking, God, that's actually really, really difficult, because you could go for so many different names.
And you second guess yourself, basically, don't you? The more you think about it.
Exactly. I had a conversation with myself. I've got a list of 4 names, people connected with Doctor Who from throughout the decades. I'm going to lay before you. These would be the ones that would make up my personal Mount Rushmore. And as soon as we're going to come to our conclusions collectively, I'm going to champion one in particular, which I feel the most passionate about. So mine are Verity Lambert, Russell T Davies, Tom Baker, and my final pick. And I did find it difficult. In all seriousness, there was a few I had to chip away for various reasons, and I did feel, I should include this type of person, I should include that type of person. But actually, when I worked my way through the rationality of it, it became clear to me that actually some of the categories even kind of roll into one another. But the one that I really want to argue the case for, that I think it would be criminal didn't make it onto Mount Who, is this one. So in some ways, this was incredibly difficult, but when I actually sat down and looked at the list that I'd made and choose someone to really campaign on, this was actually the easiest of choices. In my view, Elizabeth Sladen simply must be there. And I speak as someone who didn't grow up watching her play Sarah Jane during either of her big stints on TV in that role. Obviously, Liz, who died so unexpectedly in 2011, when she was 65, 66, she represents an enduring part of Doctor Who that I feel has been as integral to its success and regeneration over the decades as any of the leading men or anybody steering the ship behind the scenes, and one that I feel gets overlooked more often than not. And that's us, that's the viewers, because obviously the modern template for the companion is to be the audience identification figure, and they're often people of their times. More often than not, they are, and reflective of modern Britain, whatever age or sex they might be. But whether you're looking at the eager, wide-eyed and playful Sarah Jane of the 70s, or the mature, earthbound kind of adventurer and mother hen character that she is when we later catch up with her, Elizabeth Sladen never lost that connection to us through Sarah Jane. It felt like, despite the decades in between, she was still channeling her own childlike sense of wonder. And that's a huge aid to the suspension of disbelief that anybody out there in the audience has to have with them to get the very, very most out of the show. It's essential to the appeal of Doctor Who on the night in front of the TV, or even just conceptually, I feel. So for me, it's Elizabeth Sladen simply has to be there. What do you think?
Well, do you know what? I'm actually ashamed that I didn't even think of Liz Sladen, because now you say it, it's just so obvious that she should be there. And I can't believe that I didn't actually think of it myself, because of course I grew up with Liz Sladen. In fact, the Time Warrior is one of my clearest early memories. How old was I? I was 6 at the time, 6, 7 at the time. And I just remember Liz Sladen in the Time Warrior so distinctly. And the reason I think you're right, Dan, is because she does transcend. She certainly transcends classic Who and new Who. She straddles those and she joins them together, and she legitimizes both by being there. And so she casts a much longer shadow over the show than her mere stint on the show. She's then gone on into 21st Century Who and then to Sarah Jane Adventures. The shadow actually is longer than that because of what it achieved and what it represents. That let's say that joining of the classic and the modern Who. And it's just, it's an absolutely logical thing. Of course, she should be up there.
Yeah, and I think it's such a credit to her as a person, as an actress, that, for example, when I saw her in the revival era, I didn't really have any context to who Sarah Jane was.
Me neither, Charlotte.
I knew she was something to do with the show's past because of the little bits of press that I was paying attention with, that I was a bit older to pay attention to at that point. But she purely had to impress me, and I had to connect to her, which is the better word, actually. I had to get that connection of one episode and one performance. And after that episode, when she walked away with K9, I got incredibly teary. Mm-hmm. And it just hit me. It was just like, wow, this is such an incredible character. And Liz, as an actress, that she can instantly become like an aunt that you never had.
And in that story in particular, she became, I believe that Russell used her because she is totemic of the archetypal companion role, which proves my point. My entire justification for settling on her.
And I know she was quite hesitant, wasn't she, about coming back? And again, that wasn't, because she didn't want to. She was already fiercely protective of that character. She loved playing Sarah Jane, and she didn't want anybody messing about with that legacy. And already she'd got that kind of role model. I remember being very struck by how she reaches out to Rose at the end and says, "Come and find me if you need to one day," because she knows exactly what's coming.
Again, it's the same thing in School Reunion. Sarah isn't our audience identification figure. Rose is. Yes. So it's quite right that she has that conversation with Rose. Again, it only reinforces this belief. Another reason why I wanted to choose the final reason, which is very subjective, I appreciate, is because I can't help but notice that every time on our live stream sister show, Type 40 Live on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m, everybody, every time on that show, I put up any picture at all of Elizabeth Sladen, either in the 70s or in the 80s, the 90s and the wilderness years, or during the comeback. There's a sea of heart emojis over there in the live chat and comments. Literally everybody. I don't think there's a single fan who doesn't have this well of affection. And I don't think it's for Sarah Jane. I think it's for Elizabeth Sladen herself. Well, I can't think of anybody else that promotes that response, Charlotte.
Well, also, I think the name that she's now got in the fandom, because of the Doctor sort of would say this, and I think we as fans have sort of adopted it. She's not Sarah Jane. She's our Sarah Jane.
Yeah.
Because that's what sort of that affection that the Doctor had clearly. And the Doctor has affection for all his companions, but I think Sarah Jane is one who really does strike a chord with the Doctor. So that sort of idea of her being our Sarah Jane, I think, became part of the fans because of how the Doctor was. We view it in that that prism of how the Doctor viewed her.
I believe that throughout her life, Elizabeth Sladen, even when she was a little bit more distant from the show, she never stopped blowing kisses effectively back to Doctor Who fans. She always had a way with us. Behind closed doors, maybe she wondered what it was all about. I don't know, but somehow I doubt it. I always get the impression that Elizabeth Sladen did actually know exactly what it was about, where it came from, and its value. She may have been a little humbled, I think, by the amount of affection that was sort of directed her way, which was another fascinating thing about her. But from what I've heard, I don't think I've ever spoken to a Doctor Who fan who had a bad experience with Elizabeth Sladen either. So yeah, for me, it simply has to be. It simply has to be her. I mean, when I was looking down my list of various other people that I was considering for this, and the other people that instantly sprang to my mind, some of them are there because you think, well, how can Tom Baker not be there? He's indelibly Doctor Who. He's completely unmovable. So it seems silly not to include him. And then the others, I've got Verity Lambert and Russell T Davies. With Russell T Davies, up until 2 years ago, I would have campaigned just as fervently for him as I just have for Elizabeth Sladen. He may have even just sneaked it. But now I can't.
I think I'd have been the same, and it was on my list to start with, but I took him off.
Now I do feel that his legacy has become somewhat tarnished. So then it was down to Verity and Liz. But what I realised when I was thinking it through was that in many respects, they represent similar things. Not so much because they're women, which is what people tend to harp on about. People talk about Verity Lambert's sex all the time.
Yes.
What interests me more about her actually is her age. I'm more fascinated by her youth when she took that role. But again, why I eventually went for Liz rather than Verity, which some people would say would be pretty criminal, no Verity Lambert, no Doctor Who. But why I went for Liz was because I realised that Verity Lambert was very viewer focused as well. So I felt that actually did roll into Liz's role too, even though that they never worked together to the best of my knowledge. I actually think that Miss Lambert would have approved of my selecting Elizabeth Sladen. So yeah, that's how I've come through the whole process of my entire four there of Russell T Davies, Verity Lambert, Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen. But I think it would be criminal if Elizabeth Sladen wasn't there up on Mount Who.
Yeah, I must be honest, I would agree. I mean, again, she's one of those characters. Is there any Doctor Who fan out there that doesn't love Sarah Jane Smith and Liz Sladen? I just think it's unlikely that so many people who've played doctors or companions are divisive, and some people, they can be Marmites, some people love them, some people loathe them. Everybody has their favourites, undoubtedly, but Liz Sladen and Sarah Jane Smith as a character I just think every Doctor Who fan loves. I do think you're right, Dan, in that she's intrinsic to the fabric of the show, to the extent that kind of, if you like Doctor Who, you have to like Sarah Jane Smith, and if you don't like Sarah Jane Smith, you're not a Doctor Who fan.
Doctors can be made by the companions they're with.
What does that say for Liz Sladen?
Yeah,
that she was so malleable.
Yeah,
that
3
she
doctors.
Could morph with all those different doctors and have riffs on the same basic relationship fairly effortlessly with all of them.
Yes.
I just adore Elizabeth Sladen. I've come to love Sarah Jane Smith. So yeah, I'm even more convinced now after we've had this conversation. But let's move on to you, Charlotte. So you've been deliberating too, haven't you? You've been working your way through various candidates. So who have you come up with there? Who's your 4? And then tell us about your main pick.
Okay, so my 4 are Terry Nation, Graham Harper, Patrick Troughton, and Billy Piper.
Wow. That's a cracking 4.
All over the map.
I tried to get from different disciplines of what has made the show so successful and what's made it so beloved. Mm-hmm. So a big part of Doctor Who is the creatures, and I don't think anybody can argue that you can't get a more iconic villain, you can't get a more important villain than the Daleks. Yes. And the fact that in classic era, they were sort of that incredibly unique creature which sort of propelled it and made it stand out. And I just think the more you look at the back history, it's such a clever creation that he made.
100%.
But then a little bit to do with the New Who, to do with me. There were certain episodes that made me a Doctor Who fan in that first series, and Dalek was one of them.
Yeah.
So that's why I got Terry. Graham Harper, because I wanted a director, because I thought as much as the writing's important and the actors, if you've not got a good director, you've not got somebody that can convey the emotion or the tense nature of the scene, then it can fall apart a bit. And Graham's one of those unique directors which has done classic and New Who.
Yeah, the only one.
And then I looked at the list of his New Who credits because I forgot just how many he did. And so you've got the Age of Steel 2-parter, you've got Doomsday, you've got Utopia, you've got Waters of Mars, you've got basically Journey's End, Turn Left, all of the lead up of Series 4.
Yeah, no, there's not a duffer in any of
them. If you look at all of the massively impactful episodes of Russell's first run, pretty much Harper directed it. And then Billy, sort of similar reasons a little bit to Sarah actually, but in a different way. And that is 2005, so many parts of that had to be spot on to sort of catch fire like it did, to sort of justify even bringing the show back, because it was sort of talked about in circles. It's never going to work. You're sort of daft for trying it. And the companion was one of those big parts that they had to cast and prove. And it wasn't just they had to get the companion right. They had to sort of get the evolution of the companion right. And Rose, for me, and Billy's performance is that evolution a little bit that you saw Classic get near the end of, which was a bit more braver, a bit more actually solving issues and even saving the Doctor. But in the same breath, still having that innocence. I think the casting of Billy is another thing that shows Doctor Who can do castings which you wouldn't expect, that nobody saw coming. And I think Billy's such a prime example of it. Was her first acting job, really.
Yes, it was.
Represents how brave the people who've made Doctor Who over the decades have sometimes been. I think when there was no real guarantees that the formula that had worked in the 60s, 70s and 80s would necessarily work again in the noughties. I think we could all say, oh, of course it was going to work. I don't think that was the case at all.
No.
I think this casting had to be absolutely right in the dead centre of the bullseye.
Laser sharp.
Yeah.
So I think
laser sharp precision. And in many respects, the casting of the companion was probably just this one time more important than that of the Doctor. I do sometimes wonder.
Especially as, if you look at that opening episode, it's Rose's episode. It's the Doctor's in it, and of course he has important parts of it, but it's Rose's story. And
if we'd not have connected with Rose, that series would not have been a success.
So, given the fact that that's been so impassioned, there, Charlotte, who's the main person that you want to drive home the campaign for?
Patrick Troughton, because I was like, I need to have a Doctor, and I was sort of going through them, and then actually I thought, do you know what? If there's one core aspect of the show we almost take for granted now, it's regeneration, because we're so used to it, because we know after 3 series tends to be the rule at the moment, or less. We're going to get a new face. And actually, Troughton was the Doctor that had to prove that concept.
Yes.
He had to be the first sort of brave actor to step forward and sort of come out the shadow of what Bill had done, which was such incredible work, that he was the first Doctor. He made the character. He sort of gave you the core tenets of the character, and he had to come in. And the thing that I think so important, and why I did pick him more to go back to the regeneration theme, is he had to convince you it was the same character but different. He had to convince you that you were still watching the Doctor, but he had to convince you were watching the same character, but also be different. He couldn't be a copy of Bill. And if you think about personality,
because audiences reject that, don't they? Audiences always reject something that they view as a carbon copy, or just the next guy who's trying to do this, that, and the other.
But what's interesting is that at one point they were thinking of doing exactly that, and he was going to be Patrick Troughton playing the first Doctor. They were mulling that one over. Yeah, and Patrick Troughton was the one who was one of the people who said, no, if I'm going to do this, I'm coming in and I'm doing it my own way, and it will be a new character. And can you imagine, Charlotte, how potentially disastrous we might not be sitting here now if Patrick Troughton had come in and done the First Doctor, a continuation of the First Doctor.
It's not just even that. He came in and he was like, I'm going to do it, and on the surface, I'm going to be a very different character. You think about what we think about the First Doctor, he's usually quite harsh when you think about him, grandfatherly, but a bit stern. And then what did Patrick do? He came in with a silly costume, being a bit playing the clown, as he was sort of seen as initially. Well, on the surface, you thought, this is not the same. This can't be the same character. He's so different.
Yes.
But then the more you saw of him, you saw, no, he's still got that wisdom. He's got that compassion. He's got that intelligence, but he does it differently. And the other reason why I picked Troughton is I honestly think if you go through the Doctors, sort of which Doctors had the biggest impact, as much as we talk about Tom and maybe Tennant for the new era, I think more of Troughton's Doctor has sort of become cornerstones of what the Doctors afterwards have done. And that's this idea that there's sort of a surface personality. If people know me, I say the Doctor has a mask. He sort of has this sort of mask when he initially meets people or when he's facing aliens that don't know him. And it's all a trick. And Troughton's Doctor on purpose was, I'm going to make you think I'm stupid. Yes. I'm going to make you think I'm a plonker, that I'm not going to be able to do anything to defeat you. But because you underestimated him, he actually could be very conniving and very clever and very creative, actually, with the ways he would get out of situations. And I feel like that idea then became just a cornerstone for every Doctor afterwards, that they all had sort of a surface trait, and then underneath, actually, there was a lot more going on. And I also think the idea of the Doctor being slightly odd, because as much as, like I said, Bill was important, I would never say his Doctor was odd. No. In that sort of unconventional manner.
Well, Charlotte, it's a very patrician character in the way that one would often find in British literature, stretching all the way back through the 18th century. Not just in the way that he dressed, but his attitudes. The whole performance was very much infused with all of that. There was a sort of underside to him, which we sometimes saw. But then again, he played the character for a really long time. Generally speaking, though, it was largely set in stone. You're absolutely right. I've never looked at it quite like that. I think for all that we know about Patrick Troughton, and I think that obviously we non-actors do tend to sort of overly romanticize the acting craft. Troughton didn't look at acting quite that way. He liked acting for populist audiences, didn't he, Simon? He was the kind of character actor that could just drop in and out of various different kinds of parts, and as long as he could put food on the table, it was all gravy to him. He was absolutely fine with it. So he had no idea that he was doing something that was particularly worthy of praise. I dare say it was a way of keeping himself in employment. But the effect that it would have on not just the viewers, but the people that would sort of come to it afterwards, and if nobody else would have been brave enough to come to it afterwards, the series would have stopped in 69, Charlotte. You're absolutely right.
And bravery is the right word, because of the fact that Patrick Troughton was very much an established actor. Yes, he was a character actor, and so he wasn't known as a leading man, but he was still a well-known name, which of course is one of the reasons why when he first came to the role, he was thinking of doing it literally in disguise, so that people couldn't recognize him, because he was nervous. He was nervous, quite understandably, that he could have ended up with egg on his face, that could have affected his career substantially if he
his long-term employability to keep the food on the table.
Totally. If he had been the one who had brought down Doctor Who, that had been so successful under William Hartnell, he would forever be remembered as the man who had brought down Doctor Who, and it would have affected his career. So he was making a very brave, bold decision. And what we've got to remember, and you're right, Charlotte, what you said right at the top, what we forget is that this was something that had never happened before.
Yes.
Parts were not really recast in those days. That just didn't happen. So this was a completely unknown quantity. There is no reason at all why the public should have responded well to this decision. It should have been a disaster. It should have killed the show. And under a lesser actor, it undoubtedly would have killed the show. And so, again, we are only sitting here because of Patrick Troughton. There's no two ways about that.
And I think when you look at how he was with some of his companions, I think he had his connection really did at times really shine through. I'm not saying the first Doctor didn't with this. Of course, Susan, Barbara and Ian were important. But I'm thinking about Jamie and Patrick.
Because Troughton stretched it, didn't he? His characterization stretched what he could be. He could be a kind of a big brother or an uncle or a father figure as well.
Yeah.
But whereas with Hartnell, he was always a grandfather with a substitute granddaughter, largely.
Yeah, whereas with, like I said, because he had such different companions, and I think, but to be fair, I think if you think about the importance, he was the first Doctor that had one companion pretty much throughout his whole run.
Yeah.
So that really built that relationship he had with Jamie, and you really could see almost two brothers by the end of that 3-year run he had. And I think that also embedded this idea of the companion is incredibly important to the Doctor, that the companion is almost an extended part of the Doctor's family. And I just feel like if Bill started that idea, I feel like Troughton's Doctor pretty much cemented what a companion and a Doctor is.
Simon, I remember a time in the 80s when obviously Doctor Who, classic Doctor Who, was not readily available. You couldn't just press play on a streaming platform or even take down some physical media. Where Patrick Troughton, any mention of him, came with the moniker, The Forgotten Doctor. Mm-hmm. It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable now, isn't it? That anybody who played that part could ever be forgotten.
But the reason, of course, he was forgotten was because so little of his material existed at that point, and so few people had any form of touchstone by which to formulate an opinion of Patrick Troughton. Really, in many ways, all we had was the Target books. So, you're right. He did kind of get forgotten. It was almost the sort of the filling of the sandwich between the greats, as it were. And it is inconceivable now because fortunately, yes, current wisdom has completely redefined how we see Troughton.
That's, I think, what you said about the forgottenness. That's what also I adore about his Doctor now, that because of the missing episodes, because of people finding the material, that I do feel like he has become a complete and utter classic, like, favourite of the Doctors. And I think there's a lot of people that there was something he did in that initial run that I can't explain it. And this is when it does get a little bit personal for me. I can't explain it completely, but out of all the classic Doctors, I connect most with Troughton. He's sort of my touchstone. And people like I've had people when I've said that go, how can you say that? It's black and white. Like, look at how old you are. You should be able to like even have that connection. But he just brought something so unique. That was him. Like that.
Troughton, I don't want to say if he feels comfortable in his skin, because that.
But he does look comfortable.
He looks
throughout.
like he is. But as Charlotte rightly says, it is largely an act of this playing the fool. Again, I've just recently watched his entire era. Wow. And I'm like, sure, I'm finding it a complete joy. These things that I've seen that I've never sat and watched the War Games all the way through before. I know that sounds awful. I've either got bored or I wasn't feeling it.
Don't blame you.
But this time I watched it and I loved every second of it, Simon. I really
I
did.
love it.
Warts and all. I'm like, this is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
But one thing I did want to add to your point, Charlotte, is again what we've said about the companions, how savvy the writers were with Ben and Polly's reaction to the regeneration.
Yes.
That you've got that distrust because that's exactly mirroring,
Totally.
what the viewers. So I think that again, that everything was the performance, the casting, but also how do we move forward?
The writers allowed him to sort of stretch his wings. That they could have so easily gone, no, you're not doing that, or that's too risky. No, like they could have, but no, they trusted him. And I think that's what it is. It comes, I think now, when I think back in a way, sort of I wasn't there, but I can't help but think they must have known Troughton was going to be sort of this incredible actor because they'd allowed him to pretty much reinvent, like I said.
Yeah.
Patrick Troughton is such a strong contender to make it onto Mount Who, Charlotte. He's representative not just of his Doctor, of the Doctor, but actually representative of faith and bravery of everybody working on the show when it all cycles around, it's got to begin again. That they all rallied behind him, just as you said, the writers, the directors, to sell the audience on it again. Something that other shows have tried to do since in various different ways that haven't been blessed with Doctor Who's format and formula, which it sounds like from what you were saying, Simon, we have Patrick Troughton himself to thank for a key component of that. And so in that respect, we just keep unearthing reasons to etch Patrick Troughton into the face there, into the face of Mount Who.
Simon, I was like, no, Matt, come on, let's think of like more logically. If it was me being completely
I applaud you.
It would be Matt, but I had to think beyond that, and that's why I applaud you.
Whilst the panel reel from that shocker from the Charlotte Shields there, it's time for a short break now to gather further thoughts and deliberate. Will there be a last-minute jiggle whilst we're off the mic? A reselection here or there, a swap in and swap out of players in the way that the England manager would. It'll only take a couple of minutes for any of us to try and pull any of those kind of stunts. Fortunately, that's exactly how long it'll take Kev to fill you in about all the other great shows and engrossing conversations taking place across the Fandom Podcast Network. Back in a mo.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blood of Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our Fandom Flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good Evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast, we cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek and the Orville show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
And you can treat yourself or treat your other selves to a little something from a selection of merchandise over at the Fandom Podcast Network's TeePublic store. There's a link to that in the show notes, and it all goes right back into supporting the network in continuing its ongoing mission to keep you topped up with the very best in geeky pop culture coverage. Sarah, Charlotte, Simon, and I are still here making our way through the selection process to come up with the candidates to make it onto Mount Who. It's our own Doctor Who fans equivalent to Mount Rushmore, America's monument to democracy there, as we were speaking about earlier on. And yes, on to the next combatant. No pressure, Sarah. So each of us have come up with a selection of names, and one we're particularly impassioned about to get behind. So over to you, Sarah, and why don't you fill us in on the general lay of the land and build up to your main pick with the three that were in there sort of bubbling under the surface.
Okay, well, I had a feeling that there'd be a number of actors mentioned. And I nearly did pick Trout and Charlotte for exactly the same reason. And again, I nearly picked a director. But yeah, no, actually, my first choice is Raymond Cusack.
Wow.
Again, same process as Charlotte with Terry Nation and the Daleks. Terry always gets the plaudits because he created them. But Raymond designed the Dalek, and I would argue it was more... It's the design that's staggering that captured the public's imagination. You know, if they'd have looked different, would they have caught on? I doubt it. There was just something magical about that design. And it's so simplistic as well, but it's so terrifying. I mean, he didn't have much to go on. I think he was told they didn't have legs or feet. It was just a round base, and they had an eye on a stalk. And I think, was that practically it?
That's pretty much it. You're not far off with that.
In some ways, speaking as a designer, you get a brief like that, and depending on the project, it can sometimes be an absolute dream where you've got this sort of next to blank slate, and yet at other times, depending on the client, it can be like, oh, can't you give me a little bit more? So I've got sympathy as well as awe for Raymond Cusick. So who else have you got in there?
Murray Gold, which will be a surprise to nobody. But I had to mark the modern era because that's my era, and I was thinking, you know, what sums up everything? What's the common thread? And it is music. And again, I could have gone for Dudley Simpson. There's loads of musicians I could have gone for, Peter Howell, but obviously this is my era. And you know, Murray, he's done it. He did it for 12 years, and now he's come back. That's a long time to be writing music.
It's got to be more than anybody else, not just consecutively, but material.
So I think the impact, it does need mentioning, because, you know, the music can be the heartbeat of the show. It adds the atmosphere. You know, people like, you know, some people prefer the electronic stuff. Some people prefer the orchestral stuff. Some people like a mix. It's personal preference. But when I think of Doctor Who, you know, some people might think of a particular quote. For me, sometimes I can just hear like a little segment of a score, and it just takes me back. And, you know, it could be something emotional like Doomsday. It could be something actiony. And that's where I get my emotional connection.
So, Sarah, it sounds like it's a very similar thing to when people follow a recording artist for a long time, somebody who's got a storied career, somebody like Bruce Springsteen or Elton John, and you say, oh, they've been the soundtrack to my life. In some ways, Murray Gold seems like it's been the soundtrack to your fandom in the same way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was still a teen when New Who started, so like most of my adult life. So but I could honestly talk about the music of Doctor Who forever, but I won't. All right, my third choice, and again, as we were saying about, you know, casting's important, and the Doctor's nothing without his companion. But I also think, I don't know if it gets overlooked, but maybe we don't think about it more than we should, is the Doctor is only as good as his villain, as his nemesis. And, you know, Superman's got Lex Luthor, Sherlock's got Moriarty. So I have to mention the Master, and it has to be Roger Delgado's Master. He's just phenomenal. But I'm not saying that, the Doctor's foes up until that point weren't scary, because we've got the Daleks, we've got the Cybermen, we've got the Ice Warriors, the Intelligence, all kinds of things. But I think somebody, he can really spar with and reason with, and I think Pertwee had said himself, was it his favourite villains were like the villains who look more humanoid, because he could have that, he could react to them, and
that's what he said. Yeah.
I thought I'd not imagined it, but I know. I checked with the fountain of all knowledge.
You're completely correct.
And again, and because there's just something so dangerous about the Master, because he is the mirror of the Doctor. He is everything the Doctor is.
See, I agree. I agree with everything. I agree with everything you're saying in some senses, but the reason why I would hold back, I think the Daleks is one thing, but the Master, for me, because the Master would not have existed without Professor Moriarty and all these other characters, I find it harder to argue in favour of including anyone who played the Master in something like this, because it's a version of something we've seen elsewhere. That's why I'm like, really, I'm not feeling that myself.
Well, this is why this isn't my number. This isn't my big one, but it was just an observation I had, really. But I think what works for me is because he is that dark reflection of the Doctor. I think anything to do with the Doctor fascinates me. And I know, Modern Who went too far, delving in, but I think with the classic Who, because we only got little bits, because the show was still ongoing. Yeah. So any mention of anything of the Doctor's past, anything relating to him, it always made me sit up and take notice. I think there's a lot to unpack with that relationship.
When the Master enters sort of stage left like that, it immediately changes things.
It does, and again, and he only has to pop up, and it hasn't got to be a Master story, but when he does pop up,
there's a tremor there, isn't there?
Yeah, it does. It enhances it. It suddenly becomes more, and I just think Roger's performance again, it set the standard.
Oh yes, I do feel it's undoubtedly true that the Master, played by Roger Delgado, is by far the best villain in Doctor Who up until that point. You look back through the first two eras, the Hartnell and the Troughton era, and there's no great humanoid villain that stands out. Putting the Daleks to one side, because I consider them monsters rather than villains. There's no great villain until the Master comes along, and it's not that he blows everybody else out of the water. He's in a completely different book, let alone not even on the same page. And so I agree, and undoubtedly for me, growing up with the John Pertwee era, the Roger Delgado Master was part of the reason that I became a Doctor Who fan. There's no two ways about it. So I would agree with you, Sarah.
When you say the Master, I immediately think of Roger Delgado's face. And yet,
I think we all
and yet he
now.
died. Yeah, he died the year I was born. I didn't see him.
This adding to the growth of the show, and I think once we'd hit Delgado's Master, it wasn't just the monster of the week. Do you know what I'm saying? It's becoming more advanced. The villains are getting more advanced. It's taking it to that next stage. It was the super force. So I would say, I think it's just another reason that it's another kind of evolution.
Well, the bringing in of an antagonist like the Master did allow for there to be primary and secondary threats, and people who had different things to gain from gaming the board from using players on the board towards long-term ends rather than short-term ones. So that did change the dynamic and the balance of the standard adventure serial. That was the kind of stories they were telling at the time, certainly, sometimes over 6 to 8 weeks even. It was probably essential, I dare say, to have an extra quantity in play who just wanted things slightly differently from the black hat or the white hat. You could argue that the Master is the ultimate black hat, but I view him as slightly differently, partly because of the reasons that you've described and that bond with the Doctor.
Far more
Okay,
nuanced.
so all right, if I can't convince you with that, then I'm rolling out the big guns, Don. Are you ready?
Okay.
So my suggestion for Mount Rushmore is Robert Holmes.
My goodness, what a brilliant choice.
Yeah, I'm stunned you into silence, Don, haven't I? Have I convinced you? Or do I need to do more?
Wow.
No, I'm just waiting to hear. No, it's only the Master. It's only Roger Delgado that I'm unconvinced about. It's go on. Yes. So Robert Holmes, obviously, massive contribution to Doctor Who over an 19 year period. Obviously, this was again decades before you were watching the show, Sarah. So why settle on Bob?
On Bob. Well, it's not just because it is written, the most Who, but that is a factor. Because I was looking into it, and a lot of my favourite components of Doctor Who are actually, if they weren't created by him, then they were developed by him. And I think there's nobody else who has contributed to the mythology of the show. And I think this is important as much as the writing. I think you need a structure, you need a frame to hang certain things on. Any world building needs that. And as much as Doctor Who was kind of this ongoing machine that, once it got going, you literally laying the track before the train kind of thing in some cases. I don't think many people had stopped to think, and there's loads of things where, there wasn't time because they were just concentrating on getting the show out there. But the more it goes on, and there are things that contradict each other because they were kind of just making it up as they go along. But I think once you hit the end of the 60s into the 70s, and particularly through the 70s, in Bob's era, you just start to get this wonderful tapestry. And I think tapestry is the best way to...
It's interesting that you describe his time connected to the show as an era. It's usually something we reserve only for Doctor's producers at a push, but it probably is warranted for Bob Holmes, particularly at a certain period of time, because I think that what he viewed it as his job. I think once he'd become script editor, certainly because he was just a jobbing writer before, wasn't he, Simon, as I understand it? But I think that once he'd taken a bigger role, he viewed it as his duty to look into the genetics of Doctor Who, and to I think he saw television changing. I think he saw adventure television probably had already changed, and Doctor Who was kind of catching up. And I think he realised it needed to be remodelled for a more sophisticated age, and thus a more sophisticated viewer, in the way exactly as you described, Sarah.
Well, he was a very, very intelligent man. He was a very intelligent writer. And
industrious as well.
I first came across, because I'm a big Moffat fan. Stephen Moffat is very heavily influenced by Bob Holmes. His style of, making the everyday shit scary. Like with the autons and everything. There's that wonderful quote where he says, "Bob brought the space of monsters, from out of the skies and into your under your bed." And I just think that just encapsulates Doctor Who for me. And and he was so good at doing that. But when I look back now, there's so many things as a new viewer, because I was a new viewer, I took for granted. I'd always been there, that he'd got 2 hearts, Gallifrey, all that Rassilon, Time Lord Society, and it all came from the mind of this wonderful man.
Holmes, totally.
He invented the Master. That was on my list. He came up with the character of Sarah Jane Smith. There's so many things.
And it wasn't any kind of master plan on his part either. Any of this was it? It was a case of. It was still a case of these things would come up. It's kind of like we were talking about Ray Cusick. These design problems would come up. These problems of keeping the thing on the tracks would come up, and he would have to think of something very much on the fly that would slot in to, if not everything that had gone before, then something of what the series was now and what it could be in the future. I think it's a fantastic pick, Robert Holmes, the more I think about it.
And I think as well what you were saying to do with the mythology, I can't help but think in the last 5 years or so much of that has been stripped away. And we didn't realise almost, and I can say this as a newer viewer, I know probably classic fans always had this, but as somebody who hasn't got that back catalogue, but like Sarah said, for me, he was always a Time Lord. He was always from Gallifrey. He had two hearts.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until certain producers started to take that away that actually you felt almost this massive hole was now in the series. And
Bob's legacy was being harmed.
And like it needed to be there.
And I think the other thing that follows on from that, Charlotte, that's key for me with Bob Holmes, and it's a brilliant choice, is the way Bob could create whole worlds deftly in literally one sentence. So the mythology that you're talking about, Gallifrey, is just mentioned literally off the cuff in the Time Warrior. Time Lords are treated very on a surface level to begin with. They're just sort of almost disposable. He doesn't delve too deeply into them. Whereas in modern Who, I think they investigate too deeply. They unpack too much. They kill the mystery. They overwrite it. Whereas Bob knew that literally just a few words could create a whole world. My very favourite line of Bob Holmes, my favourite line is from the Talons of Wen Chine, which is there bottom left in the screen. And it's when Tom Baker, when the Fourth Doctor says to Magnus Greel, I was with the Filipino army for the final advance on Reykjavik. What does that mean? I haven't got a clue. But it fires. I've got fireworks in my head thinking, who is the Filipino army? Why were they having the final advance in Reykjavik? I have no idea. But one sentence just gets your imagination going. You don't need to labour it. It's there in one sentence. You can create whole worlds, and he did it better than anybody. Russell T Davies tries to do it, but he overwrites it all the time.
Limited success.
I think there's certain things you don't mess with, and there's certain things that you can play around with. I'm not saying everything has to be set in stone, but I think for this world to exist as it has done, because as we know, the Deadly Assassin caused tremendous uproar because
it certainly did.
It was changing things, but you considered the Deadly Assassin to other things that we could mention from a few years ago. There's just no.
And it's nothing. Yes.
It just the Deadly Assassin kind of reframed things and things that we'd that we'd not seen before, rather than things that would be completely absent or contradictory. It actually enhanced the Doctor's universe and the Doctor's society.
In many ways, I always see the Deadly Assassin as just bringing into focus what Bob Holmes had already set in motion.
It hinted at it.
Yeah, it was there. It was there.
Yeah, I think the thing is with main characters, so in the Doctor, for example, you need a bit of something to almost get your teeth into. And that's what he did by just saying Time Lord or saying certain phrases. So he didn't stand there and tell you a whole backstory.
Mm-hmm.
You just needed little bits that could get your imagination firing. And I think that's what he did so well.
You're quite right. That is what Bob did.
Well, this is it, Charlotte, Simon. It's less is more.
Yeah, every time.
This is the problem with modern Who.
I'm
noticing more and more. But I just think, I wouldn't say... Yeah, I wanted to pick Bob because I just think his presence is important, even when he wasn't writing and he was just the script editor.
Yeah.
His presence could be felt, and I think you need somebody like that. And I think you know, he wrote for 5 Doctors. He was there a hell of a long time. And it's interesting how in the mid-80s, just before he died, it was Bob who they went back to try and help with season 23. I mean, who else would they have gone to? I think it's just very telling that in that moment of turmoil, and it's so sad that he didn't finish the script, because it's you know, it sounded fascinating what it got planned. There's several times on Type 40, Dan, where you especially have mentioned this, you know, this thing about showrunners. Actually, they are just custodians.
Yeah.
And I think nobody can sum up Custodian as well as the Mighty Bob. So, yeah.
I totally agree, Sarah.
That's a very strong pick, absolutely, Sarah, and well campaigned for as well. I feel we definitely have Mount Who shaping up one more person to deliver their candidates here for Mount Who. So over to you, Simon.
I'm really nervous now. This is terrifying. I'm not even sure I can live up to any of this. I'm just like, yeah, let's just have their ideas because they're just good ones. My 3 runners up who didn't quite make the cuts. 2 of them are the same as 2 of my picks are the same as yours, actually, Dan. Firstly, I do feel Verity Lambert. I really do feel strongly. I'm not arguing for Verity Lambert. These are my 3 runners up, but Verity. It's difficult, isn't it, with Verity, because it seems the obvious choice. We kind of think, how can we have Mount Rushmore without Verity Lambert up there? Because as you said earlier on the show, Dan, without Verity Lambert, there is no Doctor Who. It is as simple as that. And I think it's almost unarguable that if somebody else had been put in the producer's seat at the time by Sidney Newman, again, I wonder whether we would be sitting here now. I think she really went. She went above and beyond what anybody seriously expected of this show. Nobody expected it to do what it did, and I wonder whether
she really believed in it, didn't she?
Whoa, boy, did she believe in it! And I think the reason that those first years worked so well and why she believed in it so much was because she was literally fighting for her job, in that people didn't want her in that job. 90% of the BBC didn't want her in that job. So she had something to prove, and boy, did she prove it. So you just wonder, in a producer who had less to prove, whether it would have been a bit more workmanlike, a little bit more pedestrian, a little bit more like they just go through the motions. It would have been good enough. Whereas Verity Lambert, it was never good enough. She was going for absolute the best she could, and maybe that's why it worked so well. So I really do think without Verity Lambert, I wonder whether Doctor Who would have taken off. I do think it is quite simple as that. My second choice, again for the same reason, is William Hartnell. Again, a Mount Rushmore without William Hartnell seems inconceivable because. Again, if that we've talked about Patrick Troughton quite correctly, as if Patrick Troughton hadn't worked, no doubt we wouldn't be sitting here now. But likewise with William Hartnell, any of the other Doctors since, I think it might have carried on, it might have stumbled on, it might have taken a break for a couple of years and they'd come back. But William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton, they are the 2, to me, centre posts of Doctor Who.
Because whilst Hartnell didn't take a chance, he didn't gamble his career on Doctor Who. No, it was kind of hung on his name, I think.
Oh, yeah, it was.
He'd probably had the biggest successes of his career in the direct run up to Doctor Who, hadn't he, on the Sporting Life and on the Army Game.
Yes. And he's had a good career. This is the thing we've got to remember with William Hartnell. He had a good career, a good film career, not in leading roles, but in secondary leading roles. And so in a way, he sort of had nothing to prove. And the fact that he took that role again, same as Verity Lambert, they were. And it's odd because you would imagine that Verity Lambert and William Hartnell would have clashed, but somehow they didn't. They worked together, or rather, William Hartnell would have clashed with Verity Lambert. let's not mince words about this. It's simple as that. but the fact that he respected her, and so you look at that initial team, and it just gives me goosebumps now thinking about William Hartnell. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of those early rehearsals and some of the early planning meetings. William Hartnell and Verity Lambert, as you see literally lightning being molded inside the bottle. It still gives me goosebumps now.
They clearly saw something in one another, didn't they? To have partnered up in the way that they did. I gather that he fought her corner and she fought his for as long as they were both on the show.
I can't help but think they were both fighters.
Yes.
They were both like in the best way, and I'm saying this with love, tough as boots, fighters. Just
both
didn't
of them.
care what other people thought.
Yeah.
Just were like, no, I'm doing it this way. This is my way. And I can't help but think they must have sort of, even if they didn't realise, they must have like connected a little bit.
I think they saw that in one another.
That, of course, is famously why Hartnell was often so tetchy, because he cared about the show so much. He wanted it to be the best it possibly could.
I do notice that a lot of the people that we're talking about were quite dogged.
Yeah. Dogged in their determination. So as I say, William Hartnell and Verity Lambert really would have to be on Mount Rushmore for me. My third runner-up, for really exactly the same reason that Charlotte, you picked Patrick Troughton, would be David Tennant. And David Tennant is far from my favourite Doctor.
I'm surprised.
I'm gobsmacked at this choice. Wow.
Far from my favourite Doctor. I don't dislike him at all, but he's far from a favourite Doctor. He wouldn't even be in my top 5. But again, for the same reasons other people have said, sort of thinking a little bit bigger than my own personal preferences, the thing with Tennant is he was in exactly the same position in many ways as Troughton was, because that first year with Eccleston had shocked everybody. It had been stratospherically big. Everybody had loved it. And then suddenly he's gone. And so the pressure on David Tennant at that time to carry on the flame and make it work was enormous. And again, it could have gone disastrously wrong. And again, we might not be sitting here again now if it wasn't for David Tennant having made it work, because the Renaissance, the second coming of Doctor Who, would never have happened. It would be remembered as a footnote in history. So, do you remember it came back for a couple of years, didn't it? One was Christopher X. I can't remember who the other one was, but it was all right for a bit. And it went away. We'd forget about it.
And whilst Tennant wasn't in a position in 2005 where he could pick his projects, things were on the up for him. He was starting to turn up, leading more things, a Casanova, and the crime drama on ITV as well, where he played a sort of stalker character. So he was pushing through any kind of anything that had been holding him back up to that point. He'd sort of been on and off telly, hadn't he? Done quite a bit of theatre work. So he was pushing through. It didn't have to be Doctor Who. I think he would have probably succeeded, but would he have become a huge star? Who knows?
I think he would have done, but he wasn't at that point when he entered Doctor Who. And as I say, I think without David Tennant, as I say, there'd certainly be no. We wouldn't still probably have 21st century Doctor Who.
I think people forget. I think people have the rose-tinted glasses on. David was a success. I wouldn't say it was an overnight success. If you look at some of them ratings for like The Worth, they were okay, but he
won people around.
He won people. There was a resistance, and I was one of them. I remember waiting for the Christmas invasion. There was a lot of trepidation as well as excitement, and I think that was another reason why Russell did that little skit for Children in Need.
It must have been a bit of a double-edged sword taking this role, because he was a lifelong fan.
Yeah, he was. Good point.
Watching this show and adoring it. So he must have thought, if I mess this up, I'm not just messing up a job, I'm messing up my childhood hero. Like, I'm going to, and like, as an actor, that's the ultimate proof you would think to an actor.
Yes,
that
totally.
Maybe I'm not as as good as I think I am, or I'm not as talented because I can't even do this role, which means so much to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that carried. You talked about loyalty. David's love for this show. I just think recently we've been talking about interviews, haven't we, with the current production team and how they've been stepping on every rake they possibly could. I can remember every interview with Tennant. You just could feel the love,
yes,
and the appreciation, and how he treated this role with such care.
I think it was that commitment, that long-term commitment, that endured the show and meant that they were prepared to stick with it all the way through various peaks and troughs. There wasn't many troughs until 2018, admittedly, but to hang on in there, believing that it was always worth recommissioning this show, regardless of the fact of whoever had left, because it had made a star of David Tennant.
Gosh, yeah, it made a star, and it made a star of Doctor Who as well, of the character of the show, and so his contribution to it really can't be overestimated. I think it was massive. It secured 21st Century Who, and so that's why I feel he should be there. And so
he's not even the bloke that you picked for your
that brings me to my fourth one, and the one that I will champion.
Okay.
And this is the classic equivalent of David Tennant, and it is my Doctor, and without which I don't think Doctor Who would exist, and that is Tom Baker. Somebody had to do Tom Baker, not because it was obligatory, but because seriously, without Tom Baker, again, I just feel that we would not be sitting here now. He casts for me the longest shadow over the show of anybody that's ever been involved in the show, simply because of the fact that you've got it there on the screen now. You say Doctor Who to the general public, and undoubtedly one of the first things they will think of is the floppy hat and the long scarf. It's unavoidable. That's what you think of. Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor, is still viewed as the archetypal Doctor character. That's how we see the Doctor. The show had been popular for 11 years up until this point. It had been doing really well for 11 years up until the point that Tom Baker came along. So it really didn't need a boost. It had dipped off a little bit towards the end of the Pertwee years, as it often does towards the end of a Doctor's reign, but not a great deal. It was still doing very well, thank you very much. Tom Baker comes along, and again, the same as with David Tennant, the show literally goes stratospheric. So it's not long before we're getting ratings of sort of 16 million for City of Death. Now, I know that people always say, oh, well, that's because nothing was on ITV. Okay, then. Destiny of the Daleks gets 14 million, which is still a phenomenal number of people. My favourite one, Pyramids of Mars, which of course is written by the great Bob Holmes, let's not forget, Sarah. Pyramids of Mars, the repeat of Pyramids of Mars got 11 million viewers.
Really?
11 million views for the repeat of it. I'm sorry. Just checking that. I'm sorry, I've got it wrong. 13.7.
Wow. Bloody hell!
I apologise. It got 11 million viewers on first screening, which is around about the same as David Tennant was getting at the height of his career.
There was a point with Tom in this role where the longer he stayed in it, up to a point, the longer he stayed in it, the more people sort of came round to him.
Yeah. Absolutely. He was not popular to begin with. He was not popular. People resisted him. They didn't like the quirkiness. But as I say, over 13.5 million views for a repeat of Tom Baker. One of the reasons I love Tom Baker is because famously, of course, he said, and I think very graciously and self-deprecatingly, he said that the role was actor-proof. Now, we've now proven, sadly, that he's wrong. That's one of the few occasions Tom Baker has been wrong, but he was wrong. And actually, I say self-deprecatingly because the role is not actor-proof. You do have to be a good actor to carry this role, and there is none finer than Tom Baker. He also believed that the role could never be developed. He said that although clearly he loved playing the role, and he's always said it's the best part of his life and it's the best role he ever had, obviously. But he also said that he felt hamstrung by it because he felt the role never developed. It never went anywhere. It had to stay the same. The Doctor couldn't fall in love, couldn't become a murderer. So he felt slightly frustrated by that. I always think, I mean, but then you look at something like The Invasion of Time, when he does become almost, a killer in inverted commas, certainly the bad guy. So actually, when Tom had the chance to spread his wings a little, he was able to do that, and he embraced it. You look at some of the other Doctors, and I don't know whether they could have played. I look at John Pertwee, and as much as I love John Pertwee, he could never have played the part as a baddie. He could never have got away with going evil for a couple of weeks in the way that Tom Baker, boy, when he goes evil, you are scared of Tom Baker. He puts the wind up you. And the other reason that I love Tom Baker so much, well, the portrayal of the Fourth Doctor, as I've talked about before, is the variation that you get. You look at the variation between those, in those 7 years that he was there, and it's massive. You look at Robot, for example. You look at in season 12, he's very much playing this sort of clownish, childish bohemian. He's a bit like, he always reminds me of sort of like a student in Rag Week. He's got that sort of feel, or just a pissed student in Rag Week. That's the feeling I get in season 12. You move on to season 13 and 14, and he's stuck with Pyramids of Mars, the Deadly Assassin, The Talents of Wen Chiang, all written by Robert Holmes, Sarah.
Yes.
And suddenly in those, you've gone from this childish, clownish student of season 12 to a very dark, somber, grave, alien Doctor. There's almost no humor in those in season 13 and 14, apart from very, very dark black humor. And yet it works perfectly, and it doesn't feel at odds with the clownishness that we had in season 12. By the time you're getting into season 15, 16, 17, it's going completely the other way, and suddenly it's becoming very lightweight and disposable and humorous and jokey and almost trivial. And it's almost you feel that Tom's not taking the role seriously. Of course, he's taking it very, very, very seriously. But he gives this impression that it's now just something that he can just shrug off and have a laugh with, and he's not taking it seriously. Then, of course, you get to season 18, his final season, and we're into a completely different Tom. People always say season 18 is sort of the funereal season, and it is.
Yeah, it is.
But it's more than that, isn't it? The characterization has evolved, has developed.
100%.
It's almost as if, I think it's only when you see season 18 that you realise, and I've got a lot of time for both seasons 16 and 17, but it's only when you watch season 16, pretty much from the get-go, that you realise how unengaged he'd been in the previous couple of years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's as if he'd resisted. He'd got lazy. I hate to say this. I think he'd simply got lazy.
I agree.
He'd got undisciplined. He'd sought amusement elsewhere, be it at the bottom of a glass or in the company of a young lady or drinking buddies. However, but somehow I think he did kind of get it back.
I think he undoubtedly. I do feel he did get it back in season 18. The irony, of course, is that he got it back because he was fighting against the producer, John Nathan Turner. He didn't like the way John Nathan Turner wanted to make it more serious, so he actually had no choice in the matter. But as a result, going in that direction somehow, even though he's fighting against it, he embraces it somehow and inhabits it. And so the Tom of season 18 to me is Tom at his absolute finest. He's literally electrifying to watch. I always think of that scene in episode 3 of Full Circle. For anybody that hasn't seen, it's about halfway through the episode, about 15 minutes in to see episode 3 of Full Circle, where the Marsh child has just killed itself, and Tom literally, my goodness, you feel your television screen shake, the anger.
Completely commits, doesn't he?
Oh my goodness! It's go on, sorry, Charlotte.
I was going to say, I think Tom was a quality that I think every Doctor needs is, thank God he's on our side. that he's fighting for us.
Oh, yeah.
That you do not want to be on the receiving end of the wrath, of the intelligence, of the anger.
No.
And I feel like Tom was such a good actor to show that off. Because in so many scenes, you felt like he was like a breath away from just exploding.
Yeah.
Tom Baker himself, though, Simon, back when he was playing the part, there was household names, there was household faces back in the 70s and even the 80s, but we didn't know actors, what they had for lunch and their inside leg measurement and all these other things that we know now, that they insist on telling us now. And so people knew very little. Yeah, people knew very little about Tom's extracurricular activities. Now, all these decades later, and he remained a man of mystery for quite a long time, well into the 90s, in fact, because of the distance that he put deliberately between him and the show and us and him. I don't know, that's unfair, us and him. But over a period of, say, nearly 30 years now, we've come to know a lot more about him, the different nuances to his character, other things that he's done, the things that he believes, his life before Doctor Who's written. I think he's written 2 autobiographies now, hasn't he, or 2 or partial autobiographies. So he's done all these things. So we know all these extra things about him, and yet the mystique of him, he's still a very surprising man. It's the strangest man. The most curious personality, and to be aligned with this show in particular. If there's anybody who has to be indelible, who has to go down in history, if Doctor Who, if it all ended tomorrow and it went down with his visage stamped on the lid, it would be completely understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, interestingly, whenever the stories that Tom comes out with, you never know, Dan, whether they're true or not.
Yeah, he's a very noted
are true. But so on the one hand, we know so much about him, and yet we don't actually know whether it's true or not. You can't tell. He encapsulates the word mercurial in so many ways. He is a truly unique human being on the planet. There are very few, I feel, truly, genuinely unique individuals on the planet. He
belongs to Doctor Who. So you could say David Tennant, he plays all these other things, Good Omens, Terry Pratchett fans, they adore him, they latch onto him. He did the Harry Potter thing. He's got the thing going where he's now part of a sort of celebrity couple. He's got all these different leaves to his book.
Yes.
Not so much with Tom. Tom Baker is Doctor Who.
Because
Doctor Who is Tom Baker.
Because although he did other things, you're right. David Tennant is able to inhabit other roles, and this is known for other stuff. Tom Baker
and there's Matt Smith now being amazing in House of the Dragon. That's another huge role to his name. Peter Capaldi is also Malcolm Tucker. Peter Davison. Tom was quite right. Peter Davison's Tristan Farnan. Peter's my doctor, but I can admit he's Tristan Farnan. John Pertwee is Wurzel Gummidge, but Tom Baker is Doctor Who.
Doctor Who, and he always will be, and he won't ever be able to separate himself from it.
Yeah, and I think that's why, and I know Sarah can add to this, when it came to the 50th, and it just felt so right that if any classic Doctor was going to show up, that if any embodiment of classic era was going to be a part of it, it was Tom. And the fact that you didn't even have to see him, and I think that's what they brilliantly did with Tom, and it's sort of what you said, it shows how much he's Doctor Who. You just had to hear his voice.
That booming voice.
Oh, that voice.
How did that, Sarah, did you feel like that as well?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, I was affected. I'm sure you were, Charlotte, but obviously that pales in comparison to anybody who grew up.
Oh, yeah.
Tom. But I think I could... I remember going to watch it and feeling that and seeing so many grown men and women burst into tears.
That was me. I was there.
Yeah.
That was me.
But it showed both generations, didn't it?
Yeah.
That thing, once again, which we keep coming up to, really. I think if there's a theme we can sort of get from all our choices, it's the people that sort of blaze across classic and new Who. And the fact that he could come on and he could just be the curator and just have a couple of lines with Matt's Doctor, and everybody was just transfixed. And it didn't matter even, because I know people who hadn't watched classic who watched that 50th when it came out, and they were absolutely transfixed, like who didn't have the background, but just his voice And his
Well,
presence-
that, of course, is that they were very clever the way they did that, Charlotte, because they knew that all you needed was his voice.
Yes.
You didn't even need to see him. You knew as soon as you heard the first word. So for me, as I say, not only is he my favourite Doctor, he just is my favourite aspect of Doctor Who, full stop. Without, I just can't imagine.
So lovely, Simon.
I just can't imagine Doctor Who without Tom. I would not be.
Well, let's be honest. Mount Who is pretty much unthinkable without Tom Baker.
I feel it is. I do feel it is.
We've said it before loads of times on the show. He is like the Father Christmas.
Yes.
I can't think of anybody else. Even now at this age, you see him as that old man, but he's still got that twinkle in his eye.
Yes.
I can't think of many other people, possibly Bernard Cribbins, that we're talking that kind of like caliber of, personality. Who can get that response out of any member of the public? Anything else to add to that? I think you've said it all beautifully, Simon.
Yeah.
Tom is an incredible actor and a original human being. I think it's very, very clear to anybody who's followed his career, whether it be for 5 years, for 10 years, for 25 years. So yeah, how could he not take a place on Mount Who there for this special conversation that we've been having, all as part of Doctor Who Podcast Day for 2024. We've been on a quest to decide whose faces should be chiselled in to the mountain, a monument to the founders and the fundamentals of the world's longest running best loved sci-fi and fantasy TV series. And just us four have been up to the task, looking back at the results, how we've worked out our findings and come to our selections here. So myself with Elizabeth Sladen and Charlotte with Patrick Troughton, Sarah with Robert Holmes, and finally Simon with Tom Baker there. It's been a really interesting conversation, hasn't it? I mean, we all know each other fairly well, but have there been any surprises, do you think? And we've had a few bills and coups, haven't we, Charlotte? Were you surprised by any of our picks?
Yeah, I was surprised with Tennant, with Simon, but I think it showed that we all tried to think above what our natural sort of loves are on this show. I think me and Sarah probably at some point had identical lists, and we just shifted them around a bit, and then some surprises, definitely.
You've been agog a couple of times during the last couple of hours, Simon.
I am genuinely surprised at Charlotte and Sarah's choices, actually. And as I say, that says more about me than it does about you, because I had in my mind what I thought you would go for. Yeah. And I thought Sarah would go for David Tennant, and I thought Charlotte would go for Matt Smith. So I applaud your choices. I think they're brilliant choices. And it's knocked me for six, that, and well done. Brilliant choices. And beautifully argued as well.
Yeah, I think it just shows how beloved classic Who is. Not like no Who isn't, because otherwise Charlotte and I wouldn't be here. But I think it just proves.
I think the thing is, it isn't to sort of denigrate or put down modern new Who at all. But I think it is just recognising that the foundations on which it's built are so key and so significant, and that's reflected in the fact that classic Who has never been really ignored by modern production teams. They might not have referred to it as much as certain other ones, but it's never been ignored. It's never tried to be pushed to the back, and we're not going to talk about that. And I think it's because the foundations are just so strong, and that's why we're still here, 61 years later.
Thank you all for your company and for whittling those lists down. I'm sure it must have been agony.
It's been great fun.
I love doing shows like this. Of course, we're wondering, though, what you make of all this. So have you got any of our suggestions that have dumbfounded you? Are there Doctor Who figures from either in front of the camera or behind that you can't believe that we've left off Mount Who here on this special edition of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast? Get in touch and let us know. We'd love to hear your suggestions as well as your rankings of our selections there. So we've got Elizabeth Sladen, Patrick Troughton, Robert Holmes, and Tom Baker making up our Mount Who, but we're very eager to hear what you've got to say, so get in touch. Yes, Mount Who has been for Doctor Who Podcast Day. Doctor Who Podcast Day on August the 9th is for the listeners and the creators, the speaker, the talker and the listener in all of us, by the community, for the community. And I've loved having this absolutely, excellent conversation, but that's the old girl starting up and calling time on this edition of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast. I'll be back with another one soon enough. Look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been over at the dedicated home feed for Type 40 at type40.podbean.com, or we may have rolled up on the podcatcher of your choice: Audible, Spotify, Amazon Music. We're absolutely everywhere. We're still over on YouTube, the world's largest streaming platform, on the Type 40 channel, with extended video editions of each and every show, with exclusive extra Type 40s, as well as our sister show, our live stream magazine show, Type 40 Live, completely raw, completely live, where anything can happen, anything can be said, and often is. So you can get all of that over at Type 40 on YouTube. We're still on the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network's master feed, loaded up with so many other treats for your ears. Never mind on the weekly. It's all coming at you practically on the daily. So please consider a trip sideways in time to get yourself more quality shows from the FPN. Maybe you'd like to have your say about all of this. Yes, this. And you can do just that if you head over to our social medias. That's Instagram and X, at Type 40 Doctor Who, or you can email us type40doctorwho@outlook.com. Then there's always the Type 40 Facebook group too. Join the discussion, the never-ending debates on the merits of the classic series, the new series, and all new Doctor Who over there in the Type 40 Facebook group. And that's where you come in with Mount Who as well. So we're going to be putting a poll up in the Type 40 Facebook group with all our selections, all 16 of them, and you can jostle them around and see who'd figure the highest there. Who would make your Mount Who, and add your choices as well. So head over to the Type 40 Facebook group to have your say and make your picks. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, and Type 40 Live Doctor Who come to you from us here in the Type 40 console room. It's been great to have you all back on a new recording block. We've got lots of creative ideas for the rest of 2024 as Doctor Who heads up to a 61st anniversary so quickly. But it's been great to have you all back here on the show. Where can people find you on social media at the moment, Sarah?
It's just Facebook, and obviously you can find me here on Type 40. I'll be back very, very soon. Looking forward
Excellent
to
stuff. And how about you, Charlotte?
I'm like Sarah, I don't really use social media, so you'll catch me in the chat for Type 40 live streams or on the panels. Lately, it's been arguing, if you were to listen to the last review I did with these two, but it's been nice to have a discussion more today.
Lots more of that coming up, I've no doubt. Simon, you're beaming from ear to ear. I think you've had a blast on this show, haven't you?
I really enjoyed this show. Really enjoyed it. This is the kind of Doctor Who I love talking about. And more chat like that on the Whonatics Facebook group. And also, of course, you'll find me again on Type 40 Facebook groups. I'm on those as well.
This has been Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast for Doctor Who Podcast Day for 2024. We have decided, we've made our choices, and we've committed to the 4 faces that are making up Mount Who here from us, but we want your picks as well. So let us know in the comments section there on YouTube, or head over to the Type 40 Facebook group. We'd love to know who you would choose to put up there on high on Mount Who. Wasn't quite the bumpy ride I was expecting after all, everybody. But yeah, really great show. Thank you. It's great to be back here at the Type 40 podcast. Can't wait to get started on the rest of them. We always have the time if you have the space here at Type 40. But that's it for now. We'll speak to you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.